What if I told you that the man who revolutionized how we think about morality believed that lying is always wrong, even if telling the truth could lead to someone's death? This is the uncompromising mind of Immanuel Kant, the philosopher who dared to ask, what does it truly mean to be human? Immanuel Kant, the sage of Königsberg, the architect of modern ethics. This 18th century German philosopher never traveled more than 40 miles from his hometown. Yet his ideas have journeyed across centuries and continents. Today, we're not just exploring his famous moral rules, but diving deep into the revolutionary principles that shaped his entire philosophical universe. How can we live as free, rational beings in a world that seems determined by natural laws? This was Kant's central obsession, and his answer changed philosophy forever. Born in 1724 in Königsberg, Prussia, Kant emerged from humble beginnings as the son of a harness maker. Raised in a devoutly pietist household, young Kant was immersed in a tradition that valued inner spiritual discipline and moral rigor. But when his father died, financial hardship forced him to abandon his studies and work as a private tutor for nearly a decade. This wasn't just a setback, it was the crucible of his genius. During these years of struggle, Kant was wrestling with the ideas that would define his life's work. The intellectual atmosphere of the Enlightenment surrounded him, a movement that championed reason as humanity's guiding light, captured in the motto, Sapere Aude, dare to know. But Kant lived through a philosophical crisis. David Hume's skepticism had shaken the very foundations of knowledge, arguing that we couldn't even prove something as basic as cause and effect. Meanwhile, the mechanistic worldview of Newton suggested that everything, including human behavior, followed predetermined natural laws. If this was true, how could moral responsibility exist? This tension would drive Kant's entire philosophical project, defending human freedom and morality without abandoning the insights of modern science. He famously said he had to deny knowledge in order to make room for faith. Not religious faith, but rational faith in our capacity for moral action. Principle 1. The three critical questions. Immanuel Kant organized his entire philosophical system around three fundamental questions that capture the essence of the human condition. These questions weren't merely abstract intellectual exercises, but profound inquiries that aimed to map the complete terrain of human existence. Later in his career, Kant would add a fourth question. What is the human being? Which he saw as encompassing all the others. Together, these questions form the architectural foundation of his critical philosophy, representing his attempt to understand the full scope of human experience, from our cognitive capacities to our moral obligations to our deepest hopes for the future. What can I know? This first question drove Kant to write his monumental critique of pure reason, where he established both the limits and possibilities of human knowledge. The technical term for this inquiry is epistemology, the study of how we obtain knowledge and what the boundaries of knowable reality might be. Kant's answer revolutionized philosophy by arguing that we can only have genuine knowledge of things we can experience through our senses, the natural, observable world of phenomena. The implications of this insight are profound. We cannot have certain knowledge about many of the deepest questions of metaphysics. Questions about the ultimate nature of reality, the existence of God, the immortality of the soul, or the nature of things in themselves beyond our experience. This doesn't mean these questions are meaningless, but rather that they transcend the limits of what human reason can definitively prove or disprove through theoretical investigation alone. Kant emphasized that knowledge compounds through the interaction of two essential capacities, sensibility and understanding. Our senses provide us with raw experiential data, while our understanding organizes this data through conceptual categories. Space and time themselves are not features of reality as it exists independently of us, but rather forms through which our minds necessarily structure all experience. Similarly, fundamental concepts like causality, substance, and unity are not discovered in the world, but are contributions our minds make to experience. This critical examination of knowledge serves a constructive purpose. By showing what we cannot know through pure reason alone, Kant famously declared that he had to deny knowledge in order to make room for faith. Not blind religious faith, but rational faith in moral principles and human freedom. The boundaries of theoretical knowledge create space for practical certainty in the moral realm. What should I do? This second question led Kant to develop his groundbreaking moral philosophy, centered on the categorical imperative and the concept of human autonomy. While the first question concerned our theoretical relationship to the world, this question addresses our practical role within it, what Kant called practical reason. Kant's answer is both simple and demanding. We should act rationally, in accordance with a universal moral law that respects the dignity of all rational beings. This isn't a law imposed from outside by divine command or social convention, but a law that reason itself generates. When we ask, "What should I do?" we're not asking for instrumental advice about how to achieve our desires, but for moral guidance about what duty requires of us regardless of our inclinations. The core of Kant's answer lies in recognizing that moral requirements are requirements of rationality itself. At the heart of this moral philosophy stands a conception of reason whose reach in practical affairs goes well beyond merely serving our desires or calculating consequences. Reason has the power to determine what we ought to do through the categorical imperative, which commands us to act only on principles that could become universal laws. This moral philosophy emerged from Kant's groundwork of the metaphysics of morals, and was further developed in works like the Critique of Practical Reason and the Metaphysics of Morals. For Kant, answering, "What should I do?" requires understanding not just abstract principles, but the concrete moral duties that apply to us in our relationships with ourselves and others. It demands that we recognize the presence of self-governing reason in each person, which forms the decisive grounds for viewing everyone as possessed of equal worth and deserving of equal respect. What may I hope? This third question explores the deepest human aspirations and connects Kant's theoretical and practical philosophy with his views on religion and human destiny. The question is simultaneously practical and theoretical. It depends on both our moral commitments and our beliefs about the ultimate nature of reality. Kant's answer involves what he called the postulates of practical reason, beliefs that cannot be theoretically proven, but must be rationally affirmed as necessary conditions for moral life. We may hope that our souls are immortal, that there exists a God who designed the world in accordance with principles of justice, and that we possess genuine freedom. These aren't arbitrary wishes, but rational hopes grounded in the demands of morality itself. The postulate of immortality addresses the gap between our moral aspirations and our finite existence. Complete moral perfection, what Kant calls holiness, or complete fitness of intentions to the moral law, cannot be achieved in a single human lifetime. Yet the moral law demands that we strive for this perfection. Therefore, we must rationally hope for an immortal existence in which this infinite progress toward moral perfection becomes possible. This hope isn't based on the desire for future rewards, but on the moral disposition itself. The postulate of freedom is the keystone of Kant's entire system. If we are to be held morally responsible for our actions, we must be capable of acting from freedom rather than being completely determined by natural causes. While theoretical reason cannot prove freedom exists in the deterministic natural world, practical reason requires that we think of ourselves as free agents capable of acting from moral principles. The postulate of God's existence addresses what Kant calls the highest good, the ideal of perfect virtue united with proportionate happiness. Morality requires that we pursue this highest good, but we have no guarantee that virtue will be rewarded with happiness in the natural course of events. Therefore, we must hope for the existence of a wise and benevolent God who can ensure that morality and happiness ultimately harmonize. These postulates represent what Kant calls needs of reason. Not arbitrary desires, but necessary assumptions that rational moral agents must make. They are both theoretically possible, since we cannot disprove them, and practically necessary, since moral life requires them. This rational hope connects Kant's moral philosophy with his views on religion, though he insists that moral faith differs from ecclesiastical faith, based on historical revelation. What is the human being? Kant later added this fourth question, which he saw as encompassing all the others. This question ultimately aims not at a descriptive account of human nature, but at what Kant's era called the vocation of the human being, our ultimate purpose and destiny. The answer is fundamentally moral. The vocation of humanity consists in developing our rational and moral capacities, using our freedom to act according to universal principles, and striving toward the highest good. These four questions form an integrated whole. They map the complete territory of human existence: our cognitive capacities, moral obligations, rational hopes, and ultimate purpose. Together, they reveal Kant's vision of humanity as rational beings who must navigate the tension between the natural world of cause and effect and the moral world of freedom and responsibility. In answering these questions, Kant provides not just a philosophical system, but a comprehensive guide for understanding what it means to be human. Principle 2. The categorical imperative, the universal moral law. At the heart of Kant's ethics stands the categorical imperative, a moral law that commands absolutely, without conditions. This concept represents one of the most influential and challenging ideas in the entire history of moral philosophy. Unlike hypothetical imperatives that say, if you want X, do Y, the categorical imperative simply declares, you ought to do this, period. To understand this distinction, consider the difference between these two statements. If you want to be trusted, don't deceive people versus don't deceive people. The first is a hypothetical imperative. It's conditional advice that depends on your goals and desires. If you don't care about being trusted, this imperative doesn't apply to you. The second statement is a categorical imperative, an absolute command that applies to all rational beings regardless of their wants, needs, or circumstances. Hypothetical imperatives are essentially rules of prudence or skill. They tell us how to achieve our goals, but don't carry genuine moral weight. They take the form, if you want A, then you ought to do B. For example, if you want to be healthy, you should exercise regularly, or if you want to pass your exam, you should study hard. These are perfectly good pieces of advice, but they're not moral requirements in Kant's sense. They're more like technical instructions for accomplishing objectives we happen to have. A genuinely moral imperative, by contrast, must be categorical. It doesn't matter what your personal wants or goals are. You should follow a categorical imperative no matter what. Examples would include don't treat people dishonestly, help those in distress, or respect human dignity. These commands don't depend on whether you happen to want good relationships or a harmonious society. They bind all rational agents simply in virtue of being rational. Kant formulated the categorical imperative in several ways, each highlighting different aspects of the same fundamental principle. The most famous formulation, known as the formula of universal law, states, act only according to that maxim, whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. This first formulation lays out the objective conditions on the categorical imperative, that moral principles must be universal in form and capable of becoming laws of nature. Before acting, you must ask yourself a crucial question. What if everyone did this? More precisely, you need to test whether the principle behind your action, what Kant calls your maxim, could coherently become a universal law that everyone follows. If universalizing your maxim creates a logical contradiction or results in a world you couldn't rationally will into existence, then the action is morally wrong. Understanding what Kant means by a maxim is essential to applying this test. A maxim is a personal rule or general principle that underlies a particular action. As rational beings, we don't act randomly. We devise certain rules that guide what we do in different circumstances. A complete maxim includes three components: the action itself, the circumstances under which you perform that action, and the purpose or goal behind that action. For instance, if you're reading an assigned textbook for class, your maxim might be, I will read all books assigned for class because I want to succeed academically. Different principles could underlie the same outward behavior depending on your reasons and intentions. The test works by detecting two types of contradictions that arise when we try to universalize certain maxims. The first type is called a contradiction in conception, a logical contradiction where the universalized maxim becomes self-defeating or incoherent. The second type is a contradiction in the will, where you can conceive of the universalized world, but cannot rationally will it because it contradicts something you must necessarily desire as a rational agent. Consider the classic example of taking others' property without permission. Suppose you're tempted to appropriate something that doesn't belong to you. The maxim behind this action might be, whenever I want something that belongs to someone else, I will take it without their permission. Now apply the universalization test. What if everyone followed this principle? If taking others' belongings were universally acceptable, the concept of ownership itself would cease to make sense. You could take whatever you wanted from anyone, and they would have no valid objection since they could do the same to you. In fact, the very idea of private property would disappear, as everyone would have just as much right to an object as anyone else. But here's the logical contradiction. If there's no such thing as private property, then taking someone else's property becomes impossible. The act itself presupposes the existence of property rights that the universalized maxim would destroy. Therefore, this maxim leads to a contradiction in conception. The universalized principle undermines the very conditions that make the original action possible. You can't coherently will this as a universal law, because doing so would be self-contradictory. When a maxim fails the test in this way, you have what Kant calls a perfect duty, not to follow that maxim. It is always wrong, without exception. Kant's most famous illustration involves making a deceptive promise, what he calls the false promise example. Imagine you're in financial difficulties and need money urgently. You know you can obtain the money from a friend by promising to repay it, even though you're certain you won't be able to do so. Should you make this false promise? Let's formulate the maxim. I will make a false promise in order to get money when I need it quickly. Now universalize it. Imagine a world where everyone who wants money makes false promises to get it. What happens? If everyone made deceptive promises whenever it suited them, the entire institution of promising would collapse. No one would believe anyone's promises anymore, because they would know that people routinely make commitments they don't intend to keep. Trust in declarations about future conduct would evaporate. The maxim creates what Kant calls a teleological contradiction. Promising would become a useless means of achieving its own end. You make a promise precisely to convince someone of your sincere intention, but if promises were universally unreliable, they would lose this function. Here's the crucial insight. The maxim of the false promise is self-defeating. It presupposes the existence of a practice of promising, where declarations about future conduct are generally trusted, while simultaneously undermining that very practice. You're essentially free-riding on a social institution while acting in a way that, if universalized, would destroy that institution. This is logically incoherent. As Kant writes, such a maxim would make the promise and the end one might have in it itself impossible. The same logical structure applies to dishonesty in general. If it were universally acceptable to communicate falsehoods, then no one would trust anyone's statements. But the very act of communicating false information depends on others believing that you're trying to convey truth. Deception works only against a background assumption of general truthfulness. If everyone constantly communicated falsehoods, language itself would lose its reliability as a tool for conveying information. The universalized maxim would logically contradict the conditions necessary for the original act. This is why Kant famously maintained that intentional dishonesty is always wrong, regardless of circumstances or consequences. The prohibition is absolute because the maxim of dishonesty fails the universalizability test at the most fundamental level. It creates a contradiction in conception. This uncompromising stance has generated significant controversy, especially regarding cases where honesty seems to conflict with other moral considerations. But for Kant, the logical structure of the categorical imperative admits no exceptions. It's important to note that the categorical imperative is not asking, What would happen if everyone did this? In an empirical or consequentialist sense. Kant isn't concerned with the actual effects or outcomes if everyone followed a certain maxim. Rather, he's asking whether you can coherently conceive of and rationally will a world where your maxim operates as a universal law, a law of nature that governs all rational agents. The test is fundamentally about logical consistency and rational will, not empirical predictions about social consequences. The categorical imperative thus reveals Kant's profound insight about morality. Moral requirements are requirements of rationality itself. When we act on maxims that cannot be universalized, we're not just doing something wrong. We're acting irrationally, contradicting ourselves in a fundamental way. True morality, for Kant, means acting on principles that respect the rational nature we share with all other persons. The categorical imperative gives concrete form to this ideal, providing a test that allows us to determine which actions are genuinely compatible with living as fully rational beings. Principle 3. Humanity as an end in itself. Kant's second formulation of the categorical imperative reveals, perhaps his deepest and most powerful insight about human worth. Known as the formula of humanity or formula of the end in itself, it states, "So act that you use humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of any other, always at the same time as an end, never merely as a means." This formulation shifts focus from the abstract universalizability of the first formulation to a more concrete understanding of what morality demands in our treatment of ourselves and others. This principle revolutionized how we think about human value and laid the philosophical foundation for modern concepts of human rights and dignity. People aren't tools or instruments to be used for our purposes. They possess inherent dignity that places them beyond any price or market value. Essentially, this formulation entails that we must treat all persons with respect and dignity, help others achieve their goals when possible, and avoid using them as mere objects or instruments to further our own objectives. To understand this principle fully, we need to unpack several key concepts. First, what does Kant mean by humanity? Importantly, he doesn't mean human beings in a purely biological sense, membership in the species Homo sapiens. Rather, humanity refers to that collection of features that make us distinctively capable of rational agency. These include our capacities to engage in self-directed rational behavior, to adopt and pursue our own ends and goals, to reason about what we ought to do, and to act from principles rather than mere instinct or impulse. It's our rational nature, our capacity for autonomous choice and moral reasoning, that gives us special moral status. This means that if there were rational beings on other planets, or if sophisticated artificial intelligence achieved genuine rationality and autonomy, they too would possess this dignity and deserve to be treated as ends in themselves. Conversely, some members of the human species who permanently lack even minimal rationality, such as those in irreversible vegetative states, might not possess humanity in Kant's technical sense, though this implication remains philosophically controversial. Second, what does it mean to call something an end in itself? In Kant's terminology, an end is a purpose or reason for action, something we aim to bring about or achieve. Most ends are what Kant calls contingent ends. They're based on desires or feelings that vary from person to person. For instance, learning a musical instrument might be an end for you, but not for me, because we have different interests and plans. No one is rationally required to adopt any particular contingent end. If you don't want to learn piano, and doing so doesn't serve any further purpose you have, there's no rational necessity for you to pursue it. But besides contingent ends, there exists another kind of end that necessarily provides a compelling reason for every rational agent. This is an end in itself, something that has value independently of what it can get us or how it serves our purposes. Rational nature is such an end. Its value doesn't depend on whether it's useful to us or whether we happen to desire it. The fact that rational beings exist provides sufficient reason, all by itself, to treat them in certain ways. If a person is an end in themselves, their inherent value doesn't depend on anything external. It doesn't depend on whether the person is happy, successful, productive, or making other people's lives better. We exist as rational beings, and therefore we have value. This is what Kant means by saying that humanity has dignity rather than price. The distinction between dignity and price is crucial to understanding this formulation. According to Kant, everything has either a price or a dignity. Things with a price can be replaced by something else as their equivalent. They have what we might call exchange value. If your bicycle is damaged beyond repair, you can buy another bicycle to replace it. Things with a market price satisfy general human needs and can be bought and sold. Things with what Kant calls a fancy price appeal to particular tastes and preferences, like works of art or luxury items. But rational beings have dignity, not price. This means they're raised above all price and admit of no equivalent. You cannot replace one person with another without loss of value, even if both have identical skills and abilities. People are not token replaceable in the way that money or manufactured goods are. Moreover, there's no quantity of things with price that could equal the value of a person. Rational beings are not equivalent replaceable. Their worth is incomparable and unconditional. What gives rational nature this special status of dignity? For Kant, it's the capacity for autonomy, the ability to be the author of one's own moral law, to act from principles one gives to oneself through rational reflection. As Kant writes, autonomy is therefore the ground of the dignity of human nature and of every rational nature. Because rational beings can set their own ends, deliberate about how to achieve them, and act from universal moral principles, they possess an unconditional worth that cannot be reduced to instrumental value. This leads us to the critical question: what does it mean to treat humanity as an end and never merely as a means? This is where many people misunderstand Kant's principle. It doesn't mean we can never use people as means to our ends. That would be impossible and absurd. We constantly use people as means in everyday interactions. When you hire a taxi driver, you're using them as a means of transportation. When you ask a store clerk for help finding a product, you're using them as a means to acquire information. When you engage a teacher to learn a subject, you're using their expertise as a means to your educational goals. The key word in Kant's formulation is merely. The prohibition is against treating people as mere means, as nothing more than instruments or tools for your purposes. What makes the difference between permissible and impermissible use of another person? The taxi driver example illustrates this perfectly. Unlike a vehicle or a horse, which you may use purely as a means of transportation without moral constraint, the taxi driver's humanity must simultaneously be treated as an end in itself. This means recognizing their rational agency, their capacity to make their own choices and pursue their own ends. You treat them with moral respect when you engage them under terms they can rationally consent to, paying the agreed-upon fare, respecting their dignity and autonomy, and acknowledging them as a person with their own goals and purposes. Similarly, when you employ someone in any capacity, you're treating them permissibly as a means only if you behave in ways they could, when exercising their rational capacities, consent to. This requires fair compensation, honest communication about the nature of the work, and conditions that respect their status as rational agents capable of making autonomous choices. You violate the formula of humanity when you deceive, coerce, manipulate, or exploit people, because these actions undermine or bypass their rational capacity to choose for themselves. Consider an example of deception. When you lie to someone to get them to do what you want, you're treating them as a mere means. You're bypassing their rational capacity to make informed decisions based on accurate information. You're manipulating their, or rather than appealing to their reason. The person cannot consent to your use of them because they don't know what they're actually consenting to. This is why Kant considers dishonesty so problematic. It treats the deceived person as an obstacle to be manipulated rather than as a rational agent to be respected. Coercion presents a similar violation. When you force someone to do something through threats or violence, you're not appealing to their rational agency at all. You're treating them as a physical object to be moved according to your will, ignoring their capacity for autonomous choice. Even if what you force them to do might be in their best interest, the coercion itself fails to respect their dignity as self-governing rational beings. The formula of humanity generates two distinct types of duties. First, it grounds perfect duties, absolute prohibitions against treating people as mere means. These are strict duties that allow no exceptions and include prohibitions against lying, coercion, violence against persons, and exploitation. You must never treat anyone, including yourself, as a mere instrument. Second, it grounds imperfect duties, positive obligations to treat humanity as an end in itself, which involves actively promoting the ends and goals of rational beings. Since rational agents are characterized by their capacity to set and pursue ends, respecting their status as ends in themselves requires, at least sometimes, helping them achieve their goals. You have a duty to develop your own rational capacities and to support others in pursuing their legitimate objectives. While you can't help everyone all the time, which is why these are imperfect duties with some latitude in application, you cannot consistently value rational nature as an end in itself while remaining completely indifferent to whether rational beings can successfully pursue their ends. This also means you have duties to yourself as a rational being with dignity. You cannot treat your own humanity as a mere means any more than you can treat others this way. This grounds duties of self-respect and self-development. Actions that degrade your rational capacities, undermine your autonomy, or treat yourself as a mere tool for others' purposes violate the formula of humanity. You have a duty to cultivate your talents, maintain your moral integrity, and respect your own dignity. The practical implications of this principle extend throughout modern life. In the workplace, it requires fair labor practices that respect workers' autonomy and dignity rather than treating them as expendable resources. In technology and artificial intelligence, it demands that we consider how algorithms and automation systems might reduce people to data points or manipulate their behavior without genuine consent. In healthcare, it grounds the principle of informed consent. Patients must be full partners in decisions about their treatment, not passive objects of medical intervention. In research ethics, it explains why we cannot simply use people in experiments without their informed, voluntary consent, no matter how beneficial the results might be. The formula of humanity also has implications for how we think about social and political institutions. Systems that exploit, manipulate, or coerce people, even if they produce beneficial outcomes, fail to respect human dignity. Policies must be justifiable to the people they affect in terms those people can rationally accept. This provides a philosophical foundation for human rights, democratic governance, and social justice. Ultimately, the formula of humanity captures a profound moral insight: that every person possesses an irreplaceable worth that demands our respect. We are not mere things to be used and discarded, but rational agents with our own purposes and plans. Morality, at its core, requires recognizing this special status in ourselves and others, and acting accordingly. In Kant's vision, treating humanity as an end in itself isn't just one moral requirement among others. It's the fundamental principle that explains why we have moral obligations at all. Principle 4. Autonomy and rational freedom. For Kant, true freedom isn't the ability to do whatever you want. It's the power to act according to rational principles that you give to yourself. This is autonomy, being the author of your own moral law. This concept represents one of the most profound and paradoxical insights in the history of philosophy, challenging conventional understandings of both freedom and moral obligation. The term autonomy literally means self-law or self-governance, derived from the Greek words autos, self, and nomos, law. In Kant's moral philosophy, autonomy describes the condition in which a rational will gives law to itself and acts according to principles it has legislated through its own rational reflection. The autonomous person is not subject to external authority in moral matters, but determines through reason what they ought to do. To fully grasp Kant's conception of autonomy, we must understand its opposite, heteronomy. Heteronomy occurs when the will is determined by something outside itself. Whether external authorities, social conventions, religious commandments, or internal forces like desires, emotions, and inclinations. When you act heteronomously, you're following a law or principle imposed from without rather than legislated by your own rational will. Consider someone who refrains from dishonesty only because they fear punishment, desire social approval, or hope for reward in an afterlife. Such a person is acting heteronomously, not autonomously. Their will is being determined by external considerations, threats, promises, social pressure, rather than by rational principle. Even if they happen to do the right thing, their action lacks genuine moral worth because it doesn't flow from their own rational self-governance. Surprisingly, even acting from desire or inclination, even from the most benevolent emotions like compassion or love, represents a form of heteronomy. When you act from desire or inclination, you're actually enslaved to forces outside your rational control. Your desires and emotions are shaped by biological drives, psychological conditioning, social influences, and countless contingent factors in your personal history. They're not chosen through rational reflection, but simply arise in you. To be governed by such inclinations is to be governed by something other than reason. It's heteronomy. This insight seems counterintuitive because we ordinarily think of acting on our desires as the essence of freedom. Isn't doing what you want the definition of liberty? But Kant argues that this is an illusion of freedom, not genuine freedom. If your actions are determined by whatever desires happen to be strongest at the moment, you're like a ship without a rudder, blown about by changing winds and currents. You're not self-governing, but rather governed by psychological forces you didn't choose and may not even understand. As one interpreter explains, you are determined by peer pressure, or by your heritage, or by your programming from your parents, or by whatever your desires happen to be at this point in time. There's a rationalist analog here to religious concepts of bondage. If you don't transcend this condition by becoming truly autonomous, you just adopt the nomos of whatever is able to impose itself upon you. You can't exist without some governing principle. It's either heteronomy or autonomy. Even the person who says, "I just do what I feel like," is being governed by their feelings, which is simply another type of heteronomy. True freedom, by contrast, requires acting from duty, because reason tells you something is right, not because of what you happen to desire or fear. Paradoxically, moral constraints don't limit your freedom, they express it. When you act from the moral law, you're acting from principles you've legislated for yourself through rational reflection. You're self-governing, autonomous, truly free. This leads to Kant's striking doctrine connecting freedom and morality. At the heart of Kant's moral philosophy is a conception of reason whose reach in practical affairs goes well beyond that of a Humean slave to the passions. David Hume famously claimed that reason is, and ought only to be, the slave of the passions, meaning that reason's only function is to figure out how to satisfy whatever desires we happen to have. For Hume, reason cannot determine what we ought to do. It can only serve our pre-existing wants and preferences. Kant rejected this view fundamentally. He argued that reason has its own legislative authority. It can determine what we ought to do independently of our desires and inclinations. Practical reason doesn't merely serve the passions, it governs them. This is what makes genuine moral agency possible. Moreover, it is the presence of this self-governing reason in each person that Kant thought offered decisive grounds for viewing each as possessed of equal worth and deserving of equal respect. Our capacity for autonomy, for rational self-legislation, is what gives us dignity and places us above mere price. Animals lack this capacity. They act from instinct and immediate desire. Only rational beings can step back from their inclinations, reflect on what they ought to do, and act from principle. This capacity for autonomy is what makes us moral agents and grounds our special moral status. To understand Kant's conception of freedom more precisely, we need to distinguish between what philosophers call negative freedom and positive freedom. Negative freedom is freedom from something. Specifically, freedom from external constraints, coercion, or interference. It's the absence of obstacles to doing what you want. Political liberty in the ordinary sense, freedom from tyranny, arbitrary arrest, censorship, exemplifies negative freedom. Positive freedom, by contrast, is freedom to something, specifically the capacity for self-determination and self-mastery. It's not merely the absence of external constraints, but the presence of rational self-governance. Kant's conception of autonomy represents positive freedom in its most rigorous form. To be positively free means to be the author of your own actions, to govern yourself according to rational principles, rather than being governed by external forces or internal impulses. Importantly, positive freedom in Kant's sense doesn't mean doing whatever you feel like in the absence of constraints. That would be mere license or caprice, not genuine freedom. True freedom requires structure, specifically, the structure provided by rational law. As Kant explains, the idea of a completely lawless will is incoherent. Such a will would be a non-entity, because it would lack any causal structure whatsoever. It would be random chaos, not purposive action. For a will to be considered free, we must understand it as capable of exercising causal power without being caused to do so by external forces. But freedom from external determination doesn't mean freedom from all law. Rather, a free will must be acting under laws that it gives to itself. This is the essence of autonomy. This leads to one of Kant's most famous claims, that freedom and morality are inseparably connected. Indeed, that the concepts of a free will and a will under moral laws are one and the same. How does he reach this conclusion? The argument proceeds through several steps. First, Kant establishes that any will, to be a will at all rather than mere random occurrence, must operate according to some law or principle. Natural causality operates according to laws of nature. Each event is determined by prior causes in accordance with fixed natural laws. This is heteronymous causality, causality that operates from without. Events in nature don't determine themselves. They're determined by external causes. By contrast, the causality of a free will must be autonomous causality, causality that operates from itself. A free will gives law to itself, rather than receiving law from outside. But what law could a rational will give to itself? It must be a law appropriate to rational nature as such, a law that any rational being, simply in virtue of being rational, would legislate. This is precisely what the categorical imperative is, the law of rational agency itself. Therefore, autonomy and the moral law are necessarily connected. The fundamental principle of morality, the categorical imperative, is none other than the law of an autonomous will. When you act according to the categorical imperative, you're not following an external command imposed by God, society, or authority. You're following a law you've legislated for yourself through rational reflection on what it means to be a rational agent. The moral law has authority over you not because it comes from outside, but because it expresses your own deepest rational nature. This explains why Kant calls autonomy the ground of the dignity of human nature and of every rational nature. Our capacity for self-legislation, for giving law to ourselves through reason, is what distinguishes us from mere objects of nature and gives us unconditional worth. An autonomous being isn't just valuable as a means to someone else's purposes. It has value in itself because it is self-governing. Kant's conception of autonomy also explains his insistence that genuine moral action must be done from duty rather than inclination. When you act from duty, you're acting autonomously, from rational principle you've legislated for yourself. When you act from inclination, you're acting heteronomously, governed by desires and emotions that arise in you, but don't represent your rational self-legislation. Only the former expresses true freedom. This doesn't mean that Kant thought you should suppress all emotions or desires. The point is that moral worth comes from acting on principle, even when inclination points in a different direction. If duty and inclination happen to align, if you want to do what duty requires, that's perfectly fine. But the moral worth of your action derives from your commitment to duty, not from the pleasant feelings that may accompany it. Critics have objected that Kant's view makes morality too rigid and demanding, requiring constant self-denial, and the suppression of natural human emotions. But this misunderstands his position. Kant isn't advocating for asceticism or the elimination of desire. He's arguing that genuine freedom and dignity require that reason, not passion, have ultimate authority in determining what we do. You remain free to pursue happiness and satisfy your desires. But these pursuits must be compatible with the demands of moral duty, which represents your deeper commitment to rational self-governance. The political implications of Kant's conception of autonomy are equally significant. In the realm of external freedom, what Kant calls juridical freedom, autonomy means not obeying any external law except those to which you can give your consent. A legitimate political order must respect the autonomy of citizens by structuring laws and institutions in ways that rational beings could endorse through their own legislative will. Ultimately, Kant's doctrine of autonomy represents a vision of human dignity rooted in rational self-governance. We are not merely natural beings subject to mechanical causation, nor are we simply bundles of desires and emotions. We possess the remarkable capacity to reflect on what we ought to do, to legislate principles for ourselves through reason, and to act from those principles even when inclination pulls us in another direction. This capacity for autonomy is what makes us moral agents, what gives us dignity, and what grounds the equal respect we owe to every rational being. Freedom, in its truest and most profound sense, means being the author of your own life, not just doing whatever you happen to want, but governing yourself according to principles your reason endorses. Principle 5. The Kingdom of Ends. The third formulation of the categorical imperative moves us from the individual level to the social level, offering a vision of what moral community might look like. We should act on principles that could be accepted within a community of other rational agents, what Kant called the Kingdom of Ends. This formulation synthesizes and completes the previous two, providing a more concrete picture of what it means to live in a world where everyone follows the categorical imperative. Kant introduces this concept in his groundwork of the metaphysics of morals, defining it as a systematic union of different rational beings under common laws. Though usually translated as Kingdom of Ends, the German word Reich might be more appropriately translated as realm or commonwealth. Kant uses it to describe a systematic whole, an organized moral community governed by universal principles that all rational beings would accept. Imagine a society where everyone is both a legislator and a subject of moral law. Each person would create laws while simultaneously being bound by them. This is Kant's vision, a moral community where all rational beings recognize each other's dignity and autonomy. As Kant writes, a rational being belongs as a member to the Kingdom of Ends when he gives universal laws in it, but is also himself subject to these laws. He belongs to it as sovereign when, as lawgiving, he is not subject to the will of any other. The formulation states, every rational being must so act as if he were through his maxim always a lawmaking member in the universal Kingdom of Ends. This principle requires that we consider our actions not merely from our individual perspective, but from the perspective of an entire community of rational agents. Would the principles guiding my actions be acceptable as laws governing a whole society of rational beings who treat each other with respect and dignity? The Kingdom of Ends represents both a regulative ideal and a way of thinking about moral requirements. It's not something Kant believes will ever exist in reality. The actual world contains people who don't act morally, and natural events often frustrate even well-intentioned actions. But it serves as a model we should use when evaluating our own conduct. When deciding how to act, we should ask ourselves, would this action be compatible with membership in an ideal moral community where everyone acts from rational principles and respects the dignity of all? To understand this formulation fully, we need to unpack what Kant means by treating the Kingdom of Ends as composed of both members and a sovereign. In Kant's model, every rational being occupies a dual role. As a member of the Kingdom of Ends, each person is subject to the moral law, bound by universal principles that govern the entire community. As a sovereign or legislator, each person participates in creating those very laws through rational deliberation. This dual role reflects the concept of autonomy discussed earlier. Rational beings don't simply obey laws imposed from outside. They give law to themselves through reason. In the kingdom of ends, morality becomes self-legislation within a community of rational agents who all participate in this legislative process. You are simultaneously the author and the subject of moral law, both legislating for the entire community and being bound by the laws you help create. Kant emphasizes that rational beings can only belong to the kingdom of ends when they become subject to universal laws, but they must regard themselves simultaneously as sovereign when making those laws and as subject when obeying them. This captures the social dimension of autonomy. It's not enough to give law to yourself in isolation. Genuine autonomy means participating in a community where everyone exercises rational self-governance together. The political imagery here is deliberate. Kant draws on republican and democratic ideals to illuminate moral requirements. Just as citizens in an ideal republic would participate in creating the laws that govern them, rational beings in the kingdom of ends participate in legislating moral principles through their rational nature. The key difference is that while political participation might be limited or imperfect in actual states, in the kingdom of ends, every rational being has equal standing as both legislator and subject. This raises an important interpretive question. Who exactly is the sovereign in the kingdom of ends? Some scholars have suggested that God occupies a unique position as sovereign, giving laws but not being subject to them, while human beings are merely members. But this interpretation misses Kant's central point. The whole purpose of the model is that people should think of themselves as sharing in sovereignty, as participating in the legislative process on equal terms. There is no external authority imposing laws. The community itself, through the rational nature shared by all members, is the source of moral legislation. The kingdom of ends formulation combines the previous two formulations of the categorical imperative. It asks us to imagine a community in which everyone acts on the universal law formulation. They never act on maxims that cannot become universal laws. In such a kingdom, people would naturally treat others according to the formula of humanity, as ends in themselves, never merely as means. The formulations are, as Kant says, different expressions of the very same law. And we can see this by noting that they produce the same results. For example, lying fails the test of the kingdom of ends, just as it fails the other formulations. If everyone in the kingdom of ends made false promises whenever convenient, the practice of promising would collapse, making the kingdom impossible to sustain. Similarly, lying treats the deceived person merely as a means rather than respecting their status as a rational legislator with equal standing. A community of rational agents who respect each other's dignity cannot be built on deception. What are the defining features of this moral community? First, it's composed entirely of rational beings, those capable of moral deliberation, setting ends for themselves, and acting from universal principles. Second, these rational beings must choose to act by laws that carry absolute necessity, categorical imperatives rather than hypothetical ones. Third, they must judge themselves and their actions from the perspective of the entire community, not merely from their individual standpoint. Fourth, in doing so, they treat all other members as ends in themselves, respecting their capacity for autonomous rational agency. The systematic character of this union is crucial. The kingdom of ends is not merely a collection of individuals who happen to act morally. It's an organized whole unified by common laws. These laws provide structure and coherence to the community, ensuring that everyone's actions are compatible with everyone else's freedom and dignity. The systematic union means that all the diverse ends and purposes of rational beings can coexist harmoniously when governed by universal moral principles. Kant suggests that in the kingdom of ends, we must somehow unite both our common ends as rational beings and our diverse private ends as individuals. We all share certain ends simply by being rational. We all value autonomy, dignity, and the conditions necessary for rational agency. But we also have particular ends that vary from person to person based on our individual circumstances, talents, and choices. The kingdom of ends accommodates both dimensions. The common laws ensure that everyone's fundamental rational nature is respected, while leaving room for individuals to pursue their own legitimate purposes, provided these don't violate universal principles. The political implications of this formulation are profound. While the kingdom of ends is primarily a moral ideal, it provides guidance for how actual political communities should be organized. Kant believed that legitimate political authority must respect the autonomy of citizens by ensuring that laws could be endorsed by those subject to them. This connects to his Republican political philosophy, which emphasizes popular sovereignty, the rule of law, and respect for individual rights. In his later writings on religion, Kant interprets the traditional concept of the kingdom of God as a religious symbol for the moral reality of the kingdom of ends. As such, it represents the ultimate goal of both religious and political organization of human society. An ethical commonwealth, a community united by shared commitment to moral principles, would approximate the kingdom of ends in the actual world. Morality, in this framework, becomes acting out of reverence for all universal laws which make the kingdom of ends possible. Every moral action contributes to realizing this ideal, even if only imperfectly and partially. When you act from duty, respecting universal principles and treating others as ends in themselves, you're acting as if you were a legislator in this moral community. You're helping to create, through your own actions, the conditions for a world where rational beings can coexist with mutual respect and shared commitment to moral law. The kingdom of ends also illuminates Kant's concept of dignity. In this ideal community, each person possesses dignity precisely because they participate in the legislative process. Your worth doesn't depend on your usefulness, your accomplishments, or your social status. It flows from your capacity to be a lawmaker in the kingdom of ends. This provides a powerful foundation for human equality. Regardless of differences in talent, wealth, or power, all rational beings have equal standing as legislators in the moral community. Kant acknowledges that in a true kingdom of ends, acting virtuously would be rewarded with happiness. This represents the highest good, the ideal unity of virtue and happiness that moral striving aims toward. In the actual world, virtue and happiness don't always align. Good people sometimes suffer while wrongdoers prosper. But the kingdom of ends represents a world where this tension is resolved, where acting from duty and achieving fulfillment go hand in hand. Ultimately, the kingdom of ends formulation provides the most complete expression of Kant's moral vision. It shows us that morality isn't just about following rules or respecting individual dignity in isolation. It's about recognizing our membership in a community of rational beings who together create and sustain a moral order. Each of us is both a subject and a sovereign, both bound by moral law and participating in its creation. When we act morally, we're not simply obeying external commands. We're exercising our rational nature as self-governing members of an ideal community, where everyone's dignity and autonomy are fully respected. This vision transforms how we understand moral obligation. Our duties aren't imposed from outside. They arise from our own rational nature and our participation in a community of rational beings. The kingdom of ends reminds us that morality is fundamentally social, even though it's grounded in individual rational autonomy. We realize our full potential as moral agents not in isolation, but through participation in a community where everyone exercises rational self-governance together. Principle 6. Enlightenment and the courage to think. Kant famously claimed sapere aude, dare to know, as the motto for the entire period of the Enlightenment. He used this ancient Latin phrase, originally from the Roman poet Horace, to develop his theories of the application of reason in the public sphere of human affairs. In his 1784 essay, An Answer to the Question, What is Enlightenment?, Kant provided one of the most influential definitions of enlightenment itself, linking intellectual independence to human dignity and moral progress. For Kant, Enlightenment meant having the courage to use your own understanding without the guidance of another. It's about intellectual independence and the refusal to let others think for you. This wasn't just an abstract principle. It was a call to action for humanity to emerge from what he called self-incurred immaturity. Kant opens his essay with a striking declaration. Enlightenment is man's emergence from his self-imposed immaturity. Immaturity is the inability to use one's understanding without guidance from another. This immaturity is self-imposed when its cause lies not in lack of understanding, but in lack of resolve and courage to use it without guidance from another. The key insight here is that immaturity, the condition of intellectual dependence, is self-incurred or self-imposed. Kant isn't talking about people who genuinely lack the mental capacity to think for themselves. Rather, he's addressing those who possess the ability to reason, but choose not to exercise it. The problem isn't cognitive limitation, but a failure of courage and resolution. People remain intellectually immature, not because they can't think for themselves, but because they won't. Why do so many people remain willingly in this state of immaturity? Kant identifies two main culprits: laziness and cowardice. Laziness and cowardice are the reasons why so great a proportion of men, long after nature has released them from alien guidance, nonetheless gladly remain in lifelong immaturity, and why it is so easy for others to establish themselves as their guardians. It's simply easier and more comfortable to let others do your thinking for you. Kant vividly describes this comfortable dependency. If I have a book to serve as my understanding, a pastor to serve as my conscience, a physician to determine my diet for me, and so on, I need not exert myself at all. I need not think. If only I can pay, others will readily undertake the irksome work for me. In this condition, thinking becomes outsourced to various authorities. Religious leaders tell you what to believe, doctors tell you how to live, books tell you what to think. You become a passive consumer of ready-made ideas, rather than an active thinker capable of forming your own judgments. This state of willing dependency creates what Kant calls guardians, those who have so benevolently taken over the supervision of men. Guardians are individuals or institutions that position themselves as indispensable guides for those unwilling to think independently. They might be political authorities, religious leaders, cultural elites, or any figure who claims special authority to direct others' thinking. While guardians may present themselves as benevolent protectors, they actually perpetuate intellectual dependence. These guardians employ a specific strategy to maintain their authority. Having first made their domestic livestock dumb, and having carefully made sure that these docile creatures will not take a single step without the go-kart to which they are harnessed, these guardians then show them the danger that threatens them, should they attempt to walk alone. The guardians first create dependency by preventing people from practicing independent thought, then point to people's resulting incompetence as proof that they need continued guidance. It's a self-perpetuating system. People don't develop intellectual independence because they're not allowed to practice it, and their lack of practice is then used to justify continued control. Kant emphasizes that the danger of thinking independently isn't actually as great as the guardians suggest. Now, this danger is not in fact so great, for by a few falls they would eventually learn to walk, but an example of this kind makes them timid and usually frightens them away from any further attempt. Like a child learning to walk, people might stumble initially when they begin thinking for themselves, but they would eventually develop confidence and competence. The guardians, however, use these inevitable early mistakes to instill fear, convincing people that independent thought is too risky. The result is what Kant describes as a population rendered placid and docile. People who have been trained not to question authority or trust their own judgment. They become like domestic animals, kept deliberately ignorant of their own capacities. This is why enlightenment requires courage. It means breaking free from comfortable dependency and facing the anxiety of thinking for yourself. But Kant's call for enlightenment isn't simply about individual intellectual independence. He understands enlightenment as both a personal and a collective process that requires specific social conditions, particularly freedom in the public sphere. This leads to one of the most distinctive aspects of Kant's Enlightenment essay, his distinction between the public use of reason and the private use of reason. This distinction initially seems counterintuitive because Kant uses public and private in ways opposite to their ordinary meanings. The public use of reason refers to the use of reason by scholars addressing the entire public of the reading world, the broadest possible audience. When you write an article, publish a book, or engage in open scholarly debate that anyone can access and evaluate, you're making public use of your reason. The private use of reason, by contrast, refers to the use of reason within one's specific civil post or office, the role you occupy within an institution. Kant argues that the public use of reason must always be free. The progress of enlightenment depends for Kant on the freedom to make public use of one's reason in all matters. This freedom is absolute and non-negotiable. Society cannot achieve enlightenment unless citizens can freely express their thoughts and engage in open debate about any topic. As Kant famously wrote, enlightenment requires nothing but freedom to make public use of one's reason in all matters. The private use of reason, however, can and often must be restricted. When you're acting in an official capacity, as a soldier following orders, a tax collector enforcing regulations, or a clergyman conducting services, you must perform your duties according to the rules of your position. In these roles, you're not free to let your personal judgments override institutional requirements. Kant illustrates this with the example of a military officer. In his private capacity as an officer commanding troops, he cannot refuse orders or publicly criticize military policy that would undermine military discipline. But in his public capacity as a scholar or citizen addressing the reading public, he should be completely free to write articles criticizing military practices and proposing reforms. Similarly, a clergyman must conduct services according to the doctrines of his church, private use of reason, but he should be free to publish scholarly works questioning those very doctrines, public use of reason. This distinction reflects Kant's practical political realism. He recognizes that institutions require a degree of obedience and conformity to function, but he insists that this practical necessity doesn't justify suppressing free thought and open debate. The formula he attributes to his error is, argue as much as you please, but obey. Citizens must follow the law while retaining the freedom to publicly criticize it and advocate for reform. Kant was writing in Prussia under Frederick the Great, an enlightened despot who allowed considerable intellectual freedom while maintaining absolute political authority. Kant praised this arrangement as conducive to enlightenment. This age is the age of enlightenment, the century of Frederick. Frederick's policy of permitting free debate while requiring obedience to law represented, for Kant, a workable path toward collective enlightenment within an imperfect political system. The public use of reason serves a crucial function in Kant's vision of political progress. Through free public discourse, citizens can critically examine existing laws and institutions, identify defects and injustices, and propose improvements. This criticism isn't mere complaining. It's meant to be carefully reasoned argument backed by evidence and addressed to the broadest possible audience. Over time, an enlightened public that has deliberated together can reach a collective judgment about needed reforms. This collective wisdom can then be communicated to political authorities as a recommendation for change. Importantly, enlightenment is a gradual process, not a sudden revolution. Kant emphasizes that those who do become enlightened will be condemned by those who haven't, and those who are comfortable with their dogmas, and even those who make steps towards enlightenment can proceed only slowly. The imagery recalls Plato's allegory of the cave. Those who begin to see more clearly will be resisted by those still comfortable in darkness. But unlike Plato's philosopher, who is enlightened by ascending to transcendent truths, Kant's enlightenment comes through the collective process of public deliberation and mutual criticism. Kant distinguishes between a person being enlightened and an age being enlightened. He cautiously suggests that while his own age wasn't yet fully enlightened, it was the age of enlightenment, a period of progress toward greater intellectual independence. This progress depends on maintaining the freedom necessary for public discourse, particularly freedom of speech and freedom of the press. The courage required for enlightenment operates at multiple levels. At the personal level, it means having the resolve to think through difficult questions yourself, rather than deferring to authority. It means accepting the responsibility that comes with intellectual independence, the possibility of being wrong, the burden of justifying your views, the discomfort of uncertainty. At the social level, it means speaking up even when your views contradict conventional wisdom or powerful interests. It means engaging in public debate with the understanding that you might persuade or be persuaded. Kant's vision of enlightenment connects directly to his moral philosophy. The autonomy he celebrates in ethics, giving law to yourself through reason, parallels the intellectual autonomy required for enlightenment. Just as moral autonomy means acting from rational principles you've legislated for yourself rather than following external authorities, intellectual enlightenment means forming judgments based on your own reasoning rather than accepting others' conclusions uncritically. In both cases, you're exercising your distinctively human capacity for rational self-governance. The stakes of enlightenment are high because intellectual immaturity threatens human dignity. When you let others think for you, you're failing to exercise the very capacity that makes you a rational being worthy of respect. You're treating yourself as a mere object to be directed rather than as an agent capable of self-determination. Enlightenment, therefore, isn't just about acquiring knowledge. It's about claiming your status as a fully human person capable of thinking for yourself. Kant's essay concludes with cautious optimism. He sees signs of progress in his own time, particularly in the relative freedom Prussia enjoyed under Frederick the Great. But he also recognizes that enlightenment remains fragile and incomplete. Future generations might regress if the conditions supporting free thought are lost. The process of enlightenment requires constant vigilance and continued commitment to intellectual freedom. Superiord, dare to know, remains Kant's challenge to every generation. It's a call to reject comfortable dependence on authority, to accept the responsibility of thinking for yourself, and to participate in the public discourse through which societies become more rational and just. Enlightenment, in Kant's vision, is both a personal achievement and a collective project, one that requires courage at the individual level and freedom at the social level. It's not simply about knowing more facts, but about developing the character and conditions necessary for human beings to think independently, debate openly, and progress toward greater understanding. Principle 7. The primacy of duty over inclination. One of Kant's most controversial and frequently misunderstood claims is that moral worth comes only from acting out of duty, not from inclination or emotion. If you help someone because it makes you feel good, that's nice, but it has no moral worth according to Kant. True moral action requires acting from respect for the moral law itself. This doctrine strikes many readers as cold, rigid, and even counterintuitive. Yet understanding what Kant actually means, and why he insists on this distinction, reveals profound insights about the nature of morality and human agency. To grasp Kant's position, we must begin with his concept of the good will, the only thing in the universe that is unconditionally good. In the opening lines of his groundwork of the metaphysics of morals, Kant declares, "It is impossible to think of anything at all in the world, or indeed even beyond it, that could be considered good without limitation except a good will." This is a striking claim. What about intelligence, courage, wit, self-control, or other virtues we typically admire? Kant acknowledges that these qualities are certainly valuable and useful, but they're not good without qualification. Why not? Because these qualities can be used for either good or evil ends. Intelligence makes a criminal more dangerous. Courage enables terrible acts of violence, which can be deployed to deceive and manipulate. Even qualities like happiness and prosperity can be problematic if they lead to arrogance or self-indulgence. All these things have what we might call conditional value. They're good only when directed by a good will toward proper ends. A good will, by contrast, is good in itself, regardless of what it accomplishes. even if circumstances prevent a good will from achieving its intended results. Even if it accomplishes nothing at all, it still shines like a jewel with its own inner light. The moral worth of a good doesn't depend on its effects or consequences, but on the intention behind the action. This is what distinguishes Kant's deontological ethics from consequentialist theories like utilitarianism, which measure morality solely by outcomes. But what exactly is a good will? For Kant, it's a will that acts from duty, from respect for the moral law, rather than from inclination, desire, or emotion. This brings us to Kant's crucial distinction between acting from duty and acting in accordance with duty. This distinction is fundamental to understanding his moral philosophy, yet it's often misunderstood. Acting in accordance with duty means doing what duty requires, but not necessarily because it's your duty. Your action conforms to the moral law externally. The observable behavior is correct, but your motivation might be something other than duty. You might act correctly because it serves your self-interest, because you fear punishment, because it gives you pleasure, or because you're following your natural inclinations. The action itself is right, but it's not motivated by recognition of its rightness. Acting from duty, by contrast, means doing something because it is your duty, because reason tells you it's right, regardless of your inclinations, desires, or the consequences. Your motivation is respect for the moral law itself. You act this way not because it makes you happy, not because it benefits you, not even because you feel emotionally moved to do it, but simply because it's what morality requires. Only actions performed from this motivation possess genuine moral worth in Kant's system. Kant illustrates this distinction with several famous examples. Consider the case of the honest shopkeeper. Imagine a merchant who charges fair prices and never cheats customers. This action is in accordance with duty. Honesty is certainly what duty requires. But what's the shopkeeper's motivation? If he's honest because it builds a good reputation and brings repeat customers, because honesty is good for business, then he's acting from self-interest, not from duty. His action conforms externally to what morality requires, but it lacks moral worth because it's motivated by prudential calculation rather than respect for the moral law. Now imagine a different shopkeeper who charges fair prices simply because he believes honesty is right, because he recognizes it as his moral duty to treat customers fairly, regardless of whether this policy benefits his business. This shopkeeper acts from duty, and his action has genuine moral worth. Both shopkeepers do the same thing. They charge fair prices, but only the second acts from a morally praiseworthy motivation. Kant's most controversial illustration involves what's come to be known as the grieving philanthropist example. He asks us to imagine a naturally sympathetic person who takes pleasure in helping others and spreading joy around him. When this person acts beneficently, his actions are certainly in accordance with duty, but they have no moral worth because he's acting from inclination, from the natural pleasure he takes in helping, rather than from duty. Now imagine that this same person is struck by grief and sorrow, so profound that all his natural sympathy is extinguished. He no longer feels any pleasure in helping others. He's indifferent to their fate. Yet despite having no inclination to help, he pulls himself together and performs acts of beneficence simply because it's his duty to do so. According to Kant, now, and only now, his actions have genuine moral worth. Then for the first time his action has genuine moral worth. Kant writes, when he helps others, not from inclination, but from duty. This example has generated enormous controversy and misunderstanding. Many readers find it deeply troubling, even repugnant. Doesn't Kant want us to act like emotionless robots? Is he really saying that compassion and sympathy are morally worthless? Is cold, grudging compliance with duty really more praiseworthy than warm-hearted kindness? This interpretation misses Kant's point. Kant is not saying that emotions are bad, or that we should suppress our natural sympathies. He's not advocating for emotional coldness, or claiming that helping people reluctantly is better than helping them gladly. Rather, he's making a philosophical point about what gives actions moral worth, about what makes an action specifically morally praiseworthy rather than merely pleasant, useful, or admirable in other ways. The crucial insight is that moral worth cannot be based on something as variable, contingent, and subjective as feelings and inclinations. This doesn't mean Kant thought emotions were bad. He simply believed that the source of morality must be something universal and rational, not something as variable and subjective as feelings. The moral law is a truth of reason, and hence all rational creatures are bound by the same moral law. Why must morality be based on reason rather than emotion? Consider the variability of feelings. Some people are naturally sympathetic and compassionate. Others are temperamentally cold and indifferent. If moral worth depended on acting from sympathy, then only naturally sympathetic people could be moral. Those who lack this natural disposition, through no fault of their own, would be incapable of moral action. This seems deeply unfair. Moreover, emotions fluctuate. You might feel compassionate today, but irritable and unsympathetic tomorrow. If moral worth depended on feeling, your actions would have moral value only when you happen to be in the right mood. But morality demands consistency. It requires that we do our duty regardless of how we happen to feel at the moment. A morality based on emotion would be unstable and unreliable. Finally, emotions can be manipulated and directed toward unworthy objects. People have felt passionate about defending slavery, persecuting minorities, and committing atrocities. Strong feelings alone don't make actions right. We need a rational standard independent of emotion to evaluate whether our feelings are properly directed. Duty, by contrast, provides a stable, universal foundation for morality. The moral law applies to all rational beings equally, regardless of their emotional temperament or current mood. Whether you're naturally sympathetic or cold, whether you feel generous today or irritable, your duty remains the same. Morality based on duty is consistent, impartial, and accessible to everyone who can reason. This brings us back to the grieving philanthropist. Kant's point isn't that the grieving state is morally superior. Rather, he's using an extreme case to isolate and highlight what makes an action morally worthy. When someone who enjoys helping others does so, we can't tell whether they're acting from duty or from inclination. Both motivations point in the same direction. But when someone who has no inclination to help, who feels no pleasure in it, nevertheless helps because it's their duty, we can see pure moral motivation at work. The grief strips away all other motivations, leaving only duty itself. Importantly, Kant isn't saying we should prefer the grieving state. Ideally, duty and inclination would align. You would both want to do what's right and recognize it as your duty. When both motivations are present, you should certainly act, and you get moral credit for acting from duty, even if you also happen to enjoy it. The point is simply that the moral worth comes from the duty component, not from the pleasure. In fact, Kant suggests that we have an indirect duty to cultivate sympathetic feelings and emotional responses that align with morality. Emotions like sympathy, while not themselves sources of moral worth, can help motivate us to do our duty and make moral action psychologically easier. A person with warm feelings toward humanity will find it easier to act beneficently than someone emotionally cold, even though both face the same moral requirements. So Kant actually endorses cultivating emotions, not as replacements for duty, but as supports for it. The key is that emotions must be guided by reason rather than reason serving the emotions. This reverses the position of philosophers like David Hume, who argued that reason is, and ought only to be, the slave of the passions. For Hume, reason's only job is figuring out how to satisfy whatever desires we happen to have. Kant insists the opposite. Reason must govern our passions, determining which desires are worth pursuing and which should be resisted. Consider what Kant calls bare respect for the moral law, the distinctive motivation of acting from duty. This isn't an emotion in the ordinary sense. It's more like a recognition or acknowledgement of the binding force of moral requirements. When you act from respect for the moral law, you're acknowledging that certain principles have authority over you simply because they're rational requirements. You're not calculating benefits or following feelings, but recognizing an obligation. This kind of motivation is unique to rational beings. Animals can't act from duty because they can't grasp abstract rational principles. They act from instinct and immediate desire. Only creatures capable of reasoning about what they ought to do, capable of recognizing moral law and acting from respect for it, can have a good will. This capacity for dutiful action is part of what gives human beings special moral status and dignity. It's worth noting that Kant's position has been refined and debated extensively by contemporary philosophers. Some argue that Kant wasn't as hostile to emotion as the standard reading suggests. Others propose modifications to accommodate the intuition that motivation by appropriate emotions does contribute to moral worth. Still others defend the traditional interpretation, arguing that Kant's strict distinction between duty and inclination is philosophically sound, even if psychologically demanding. Regardless of these debates, Kant's core insight remains powerful. Morality cannot be reduced to doing what comes naturally or feels good. If morality is to provide genuinely binding obligations, requirements that apply to everyone regardless of their desires, it must be grounded in reason rather than emotion. The moral law isn't just a summary of what most people happen to want. It's a rational requirement that has authority even when it conflicts with our inclinations. This is why Kant insists on the primacy of duty. Acting from duty means acknowledging the authority of reason over desire, principle over preference, the moral law over personal inclination. It means recognizing that some things are required of us not because they serve our interests or satisfy our emotions, but simply because they're right. This capacity to act from duty, to be motivated by rational principle rather than mere feeling, is what distinguishes genuinely moral action from behavior that merely conforms externally to moral requirements. And it's this capacity that Kant sees as central to human dignity and the possibility of a moral life. Principle 8. Transcendental Idealism. The Limits of Knowledge. At the foundation of Kant's entire philosophical system lies the doctrine of transcendental idealism, which emphasizes a fundamental distinction between what we can experience, the natural, observable world, and what we cannot, supersensible objects such as God and the soul. This revolutionary theory represents Kant's attempt to resolve the deep conflicts between rationalism and empiricism, between the claims of science and the demands of morality, and between our desire for knowledge and the actual limits of human cognition. Kant argued that we never experience reality as it is in itself, but only as it appears to us through the structures of our own minds. This claim sounds strange to modern ears, almost like a form of skepticism or relativism, but Kant intended precisely the opposite. By carefully mapping the limits of what we can know, he aimed to secure the foundations of human knowledge on firmer ground than ever before. The core of transcendental idealism rests on distinguishing between phenomena, appearances, and noumena, things in themselves. Phenomena are objects as they appear to us through our sensory experience, structured by the forms and categories our minds contribute. Noumena are things as they exist independently of our experience, reality in itself, unconditioned by the subjective features of human cognition. Kant insists that we can have knowledge only of phenomena, not of noumena. This distinction emerges from Kant's analysis of how human knowledge works. All our knowledge, according to Kant, requires two distinct faculties working together: sensibility and understanding. Sensibility provides us with raw sensory data through intuition, immediate, singular representations of objects. Understanding processes this data by organizing it through concepts and categories. Neither faculty alone can generate knowledge. Thoughts without content are empty, intuitions without concepts are blind, as Kant famously wrote. Space and time aren't features of the universe itself. They're the forms through which our minds organize experience. This is one of Kant's most startling and controversial claims. Most people naturally assume that space and time are objective features of reality that exist whether or not any minds are around to perceive them. Kant argues instead that space and time are contributed by our minds as necessary structures for organizing sensory experience. What does it mean to call space and time forms of intuition? A form, in Kant's terminology, is a structuring principle, a framework that organizes content. Space is the form of outer sense, the framework through which we organize our experience of external objects. Time is the form of inner sense, the framework through which we organize our experience of our own mental states. All objects we can possibly experience must appear to us within these frameworks. Kant offers several arguments for why space and time must be a priori forms of intuition rather than concepts derived from experience. First, we cannot imagine experiencing anything that isn't in space and time. Try to imagine an object that exists but isn't located anywhere in space or at any point in time. It's impossible. This suggests that space and time are preconditions for any possible experience, not features we abstract from experience. Second, space and time are singular rather than general. There is only one space, containing all spatial locations as parts of itself, and only one time, containing all temporal moments as parts of itself. This makes them more like intuitions, which are singular representations, than concepts, which are general representations that can apply to many different things. The concept red can apply to many different red objects, but space and time don't apply to multiple things. They are the all-encompassing frameworks within which things appear. Third, space and time contain an infinity of possible points and moments within them. No concept can contain infinite particulars within itself, but intuitions can represent infinite structure. This infinity within unity suggests that space and time are intuitions rather than concepts. The implications of this theory are profound. If space and time are contributions our minds make to experience rather than features of reality itself, then the spatial and temporal properties of objects belong to appearances, not to things in themselves. Objects as they appear to us are in space and time, but we cannot say whether things in themselves have spatial or temporal properties. These properties might be mind-dependent, features that objects have only in relation to our mode of experiencing them. Beyond the forms of intuition, the understanding contributes its own structuring principles, the categories. Categories are pure concepts of the understanding, a priori concepts that the mind uses to organize and synthesize sensory data into coherent experience. Kant identifies 12 fundamental categories organized into 4 groups: quantity, unity, plurality, totality, quality, reality, negation, limitation, relation, substance, causality, community, and modality, possibility, existence, necessity. These categories aren't learned from experience, but are preconditions for having coherent experience at all. For example, the category of causality isn't something we observe in the world. We can't directly perceive causation, only successions of events. Rather, causality is a framework our understanding imposes on experience, allowing us to organize events into causal relationships. When we experience one event following another, our understanding structures this experience by applying the category of causality, leading us to judge that the first event caused the second. This analysis reveals what Kant calls his Copernican revolution in philosophy. Just as Copernicus revolutionized astronomy by suggesting that the apparent motion of the stars results from the Earth's movement, rather than the stars moving around a stationary Earth, Kant revolutionized philosophy by suggesting that objects must conform to our knowledge, rather than our knowledge conforming to objects. Traditional philosophy assumed that our minds must passively conform to objects, as they exist independently of us. On this view, knowledge means accurately representing how things really are, out there. But this led to insoluble problems. How can we know that our representations match reality if we can never step outside our representations to compare them with things in themselves? David Hume had shown that crucial principles like causation couldn't be derived from experience alone, leading to skepticism about whether we have genuine knowledge of the world. Kant's revolutionary proposal inverts the traditional relationship. Instead of assuming our knowledge must conform to objects, he suggests that objects must conform to our knowledge, or more precisely, that objects as we experience them are partly constituted by the structures our minds contribute. Objects of experience aren't things in themselves but phenomena, objects as they appear within the frameworks of space, time, and the categories. This move allows Kant to explain how we can have synthetic a priori knowledge that is both informative about the world and known independently of particular experiences. Synthetic judgments are those where the predicate adds information not contained in the subject. All bachelors are unmarried is analytic. Unmarried is part of what bachelor means, but every event has a cause is synthetic because has a cause adds information not contained in the concept of event. Kant's predecessors generally assumed that all synthetic knowledge must be a posteriori, derived from experience, while a priori knowledge must be analytic, true by definition. But Kant argues that we have synthetic a priori knowledge in mathematics, geometry, and fundamental principles of natural science. Mathematical truths like 7 plus 5 is equal to 12 aren't merely analytic definitions, but tell us something substantive about any possible quantities. Similarly, the principle that every event has a cause isn't just a definition, but a substantial claim about how events must be structured. How is synthetic a priori knowledge possible? Kant's answer is that such knowledge is possible precisely because objects of experience must conform to the structures our minds impose. We can know a priori that all experienced objects will be in space and time because space and time are forms of intuition we contribute. We can know a priori that all experienced events will have causes because causality is a category we necessarily apply in organizing experience. These principles don't describe things in themselves, but the necessary structure of any possible experience. By showing the limits of theoretical knowledge, Kant carved out space for moral certainty. This was one of his central motivations for developing transcendental idealism. The mechanistic worldview of Newtonian science seemed to imply that everything, including human behavior, follows predetermined natural laws. If this applies to things in themselves, then human freedom appears impossible. We're just parts of a vast causal machine. But Kant's distinction between phenomena and noumena opens a path around this problem. The deterministic laws of nature apply to phenomena, objects as they appear within space, time, and the categories. As phenomenal beings, we are indeed part of the causal order of nature. But as noumenal beings, as things in themselves, we might be free in a way that transcends natural causation. Theoretical reason cannot prove we're free, but neither can it prove we're not. By limiting the claims of theoretical knowledge, Kant makes room for practical faith in human freedom and moral responsibility. This connects to Kant's famous statement that he had to deny knowledge in order to make room for faith. This doesn't mean denying all knowledge or embracing irrationality. Rather, it means recognizing that theoretical reason has limits. There are questions it cannot definitively answer. We cannot have theoretical knowledge of God, immortality, or transcendent freedom because these concern things in themselves beyond possible experience. But practical reason, our capacity for moral judgment, requires that we affirm these as necessary postulates for moral life. Critics have raised numerous objections to transcendental idealism. One persistent problem concerns how we can even speak meaningfully about things in themselves if we can have no knowledge of them. Kant seems to both affirm their existence and deny that we can know anything about them. Moreover, he appears to violate his own principles by applying categories like existence and causality to noumena, even though he claims categories apply only to phenomena. Another interpretive debate concerns whether the distinction between phenomena and noumena represents a distinction between two worlds or two aspects of the same world. On the two-world reading, phenomena and noumena are entirely different kinds of entities. Appearances form one realm, things in themselves another. On the two-aspect reading, they're the same entities considered under different descriptions, as they appear to us versus as they are in themselves. Contemporary scholars continue debating these issues, recognizing both the profound insights and persistent puzzles in Kant's transcendental idealism. What remains undeniable is that Kant fundamentally transformed how we think about the relationship between mind and world, knowledge and reality, science and morality. By arguing that our minds actively contribute to structuring experience rather than passively receiving information from an independent reality, Kant inaugurated what he rightly called a Copernican revolution in philosophy, one whose implications philosophers are still working through today. The critique and counterarguments. But Kant's system isn't without its shadows. Over the centuries since he wrote, philosophers have raised searching objections to both his moral philosophy and his metaphysical framework. These criticisms reveal genuine tensions in Kant's thought. Tensions between abstract principle and concrete application, between universal reason and particular circumstances, between what his system demands and what human nature can realistically achieve. Critics have long questioned whether his moral philosophy is too rigid and demanding. The most notorious example involves what's come to be known as the inquiring murderer case. Can being truthful really be wrong, even when it would save an innocent life? Kant's famous answer was yes. Even if someone intending harm asks if their intended victim is in your house, you must not provide false information. The case originated with the French philosopher Benjamin Constant, who in 1797 attributed to Kant the thesis that it would be a crime to lie to someone who asked us whether a friend of ours, whom he was pursuing, had perhaps taken refuge in our house. Constant assumed Kant would never defend such an absolutist position. But to the surprise of many, Kant doubled down, insisting on an absolute duty of truthfulness even in this extreme scenario. Kant's reasoning centered on the idea that providing false information violates a duty of right, a perfect duty that admits no exceptions. When you make a statement to another person who has a right to expect truthfulness, you enter a particular kind of social relation governed by duties of justice. Falsifying the truth undermines the entire system of communication and trust that makes society possible. Moreover, you cannot predict or control all the consequences of your actions. Perhaps your friend has secretly left the house, and your false information inadvertently directs the attacker to where your friend actually is. This seeming inflexibility has led many to question whether Kantian ethics can handle the complexity of real moral situations. How do we apply abstract principles to messy, contextual human problems? The universalizability test and the categorical imperative provide a powerful framework for moral reasoning, but critics argue they're too blunt an instrument for the nuanced judgments real life demands. Some interpreters have tried to save Kant from the implications of his own theory. Perhaps you could remain silent rather than answering. Perhaps the threatening person has no right to truthful information, so your statement doesn't count as a declaration in Kant's technical sense. Perhaps duties of virtue, like protecting innocent life, can override duties of right, like truthfulness, in extreme cases. Christine Korsgaard argues that you face a duty to lie grounded in self-respect, refusing to let your honesty be weaponized for evil purposes. But these defenses, however ingenious, suggest that Kant's original position was problematic. The very fact that sympathetic interpreters must work so hard to avoid the theory's seemingly absurd implications points to genuine rigidity in the system. Critics charge that Kant's ethics suffers from excessive rigorism, an uncompromising adherence to rules that allows no flexibility even when circumstances seem to demand it. The charge of rigorism connects to broader worries about formalism in Kantian ethics. Critics argue that because Kant's system concentrates on principles or rules, it risks being either empty and lacking substantive content or rigidly uniform in its prescriptions. Hegel's famous empty formalism objection argues that the categorical imperative's pure formality makes it incapable of determining specific moral content. For instance, Kant thinks he can show that taking what belongs to others violates the categorical imperative because universalizing it would create a contradiction. But Hegel argues this only works if you first assume the institution of property exists, and the categorical imperative can't tell you whether property itself is moral or immoral. Other philosophers have charged Kant's system with the opposite problem, not emptiness but excessive rigidity. By insisting that certain actions are categorically right or wrong regardless of context or consequences, Kantian ethics allegedly produces morally unacceptable outcomes in specific situations. The insistence that you can never provide false information to someone intending harm exemplifies this inflexibility. Others have challenged Kant's metaphysical commitments. Is the distinction between phenomena and noumena coherent? If we can't know things in themselves, how can we even meaningfully talk about them? This objection troubled even Kant's immediate successors. Fichte, Schelling, and Hegel all rejected the thing in itself as either inconsistent or unnecessary. The problem is that Kant seems to both affirm and deny knowledge of things in themselves. He says we cannot know noumena because knowledge requires both intuition and concepts, and we have no intuitions of things beyond possible experience. Yet he also applies categories like existence and causality to things in themselves, saying they exist and affect our sensibility. But categories, on Kant's own account, apply only to objects of possible experience. If things in themselves are beyond experience, how can we legitimately say anything about them at all? As one critic puts it, the noumenal world is problematic, inconsistent, self-contradictory, and limiting in concept. If the noumenal world is not intelligible epistemologically, then of what use is the concept? This tension has generated extensive debate among Kant scholars about how to interpret the phenomena/noumena distinction, whether it represents two distinct kinds of entities or merely two aspects of the same reality. Modern philosophers have also questioned whether Kant's vision of rational autonomy adequately accounts for human emotions, relationships, and cultural differences. Does his emphasis on universal reason ignore the particularities that make us human? Feminist philosophers have raised particularly searching criticisms. Some argue that Kant's conception of rational autonomy reflects a distinctively masculine approach to morality that undervalues traditionally feminine virtues like care, compassion, and attention to relationships. The ethics of care tradition emphasizes the moral importance of particular relationships, emotional responsiveness, and contextual judgment, precisely the elements Kantian ethics seems to minimize or exclude. Carol Gilligan's influential work suggested that men and women tend to approach moral problems differently, men emphasizing abstract principles and rights, women emphasizing relationships and responsibilities. While this empirical claim remains controversial, it raises philosophical questions about whether Kant's focus on universal rational principles captures the full range of morally relevant considerations. Can an adequate moral theory afford to downplay the significance of care, empathy, and particular relationships? Defenders of Kant respond that his theory doesn't actually exclude these considerations. Duties to develop sympathetic feelings, to help others achieve their ends, and to cultivate caring relationships can all be grounded in Kantian principles. Moreover, Kant's insistence on treating people as ends in themselves provides powerful resources for feminist critiques of exploitation and objectification. Still, the tension between Kant's rationalist universalism and the particularist concerns of care ethics remains a lively debate. Cultural relativists challenge Kant's commitment to universal moral principles. In an age of cultural diversity, how can we justify the claim that the same moral requirements apply to all rational beings regardless of their cultural context? Different cultures have profoundly different moral frameworks. What seems obviously right in one culture may seem obviously wrong in another. Doesn't Kant's universalism impose a particular, perhaps Western, Enlightenment, moral framework on diverse peoples with their own legitimate moral traditions? Kant would respond that moral requirements flow from rational nature itself, not from any particular cultural tradition. The categorical imperative doesn't prescribe specific cultural practices, but rather formal principles that constrain how we can act toward other rational beings. Different cultures might legitimately develop different specific practices, while still respecting these underlying principles. But critics worry that even this formal universalism fails to appreciate the depth of moral disagreement across cultures and the legitimate plurality of moral frameworks humanity has developed. Perhaps most troubling, some critics point to problematic elements in Kant's own writings about race and gender that seem to contradict his own principles. His empirical anthropology contains statements about the supposed inferiority of non-Europeans and women that clash with his philosophical commitment to the equal dignity of all rational beings. This raises difficult questions about the relationship between Kant's systematic philosophy and his particular prejudices, and whether those prejudices might have infected the philosophical system itself at some deeper level. These criticisms reveal genuine tensions and limitations in Kant's philosophy, yet they also testify to its enduring importance. Philosophers continue wrestling with these problems precisely because Kant's questions and insights remain central to how we think about morality, knowledge, and human nature. Whether his answers ultimately succeed or fail, Kant's systematic attempt to ground morality in reason rather than tradition, emotion, or divine command continues to shape contemporary ethical thought. So what's the core takeaway from Kant's uncompromising vision? His insight remains powerfully relevant, that being human means living in the tension between our natural desire-driven selves and our capacity for rational, moral action. In our age of moral relativism, Kant reminds us that some things, human dignity, truth, justice, might be absolute values worth defending regardless of consequences. When we feel the pull of moral obligation, we're experiencing something uniquely human. The capacity to act not from what we want, but from what we ought to do. Kant's three questions still guide us today. In an era of information overload, we need to ask what we can truly know. Facing ethical dilemmas in technology, politics, and personal life, we must ask what we should do. And confronting uncertainty and mortality, we wonder what we may hope. Perhaps Kant's greatest gift is showing us that philosophy isn't just academic exercise. It's the attempt to understand what makes us human. As he challenged his contemporaries, "Sapere aude, dare to know. Have the courage to use your own understanding." What do you think? Does Kant's vision of rational autonomy still speak to our modern condition? Or do we need new frameworks for understanding human dignity and moral obligation? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more deep dives into the minds that shaped our world.